Welcome to Never Again is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. I am Evelyn Marcus, and in addition to being a psychologist, I am featured in the documentary about anti-Semitism, Never Again is Now. I'm a Dutch Jew and a daughter of Holocaust survivors. In 2006, I immigrated from Holland to the United States because of the rising anti-Semitism in Europe.
I'm Phyllis Zembler-Miller. I'm the founder of the free nonfiction Holocaust theater project, thinedgethewedge.com. I grew up in the Midwest in a small town that had one synagogue. I was the only Jewish child in my public school classes. It was not a Holocaust community. Our parents and grandparents had come at the turn of the previous century to escape the Tsar and other pogroms. Yet in 1970, my husband and I were stationed in Munich, Germany with the US Army, and it changed our lives forever. Evelyn?
Michael Berenbaum, PhD and rabbi, is the director of the Sigi Ziering Institute, exploring the ethical and religious implications of the Holocaust, and a professor of Jewish studies in the American Jewish University in Los Angeles. He is the author of several nonfiction books about the Holocaust. And for those of you who watch documentaries about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism, he's a familiar interviewee. While Michael has many areas of expertise, today we want to speak with him about his recent trip to Malmö, Sweden, made at the invitation of the city's mayor to open a traveling exhibition named Auschwitz, Not Long Ago, Not Far Away. Journalist David Stavru wrote in March of this year, "For over 10 years now, Malmö has become, in the eyes of many, a symbol of a new kind of Swedish anti-Semitism. While right-wing extremism is still dangerous and threatens Jews in Malmö, just like anywhere else, in the last few years, an imported anti-Semitism originating in the Middle East and Islamist environments has taken over." Stavru also wrote, in 2021, a report commissioned by the municipality described Malmö schools as an unsafe environment for Jewish students who suffer from verbal and physical attacks, while teachers prefer to avoid conflict with the aggressors.
Michael,
welcome to our show, and thank you for coming on.
Right, and I get to ask the first question today. Besides Stavro calling out right-wing extremists and Islamists regarding anti-Semitism in Sweden, he also called out left-wing progressives in Sweden. Do you feel the primary forces of anti-Semitism in Sweden are representative of the anti-Semitism of other European countries and elsewhere in the world?
Let me step back for a moment and answer that indirectly. I came at the invitation of the mayor of Sweden, the mayor of Malmö, and I came for this special exhibition, Auschwitz, not long ago, not far away, which has been traveling the world and will continue to travel the world, and we're even hoping that it'll come to Los Angeles. I came there because the leadership of Malmö, both the local, the regional, and even the national leadership of Sweden wants to confront anti-Semitism, and felt that this was a very important tool with which to confront anti-Semitism. Now, to answer your question specifically, I think that we have to distinguish anti-Semitism has different sources. The sources sometimes are religious, they are political, they are social, they are economic. In the Nazi case, they were racial. Anti-Semitism also has a second factor, which is anti-Semitism has different goals. If you have religious anti-Semitism, the ultimate goal is conversion. If you have political anti-Semitism, you have two goals historically. One is diminishment of the exaggerated sense of Jewish power. The other can be expulsion. If you have social anti-Semitism, you want exclusion. I don't want you a member of my club. I don't want you in my social circle, etc. In the Nazi case, when we had racial anti-Semitism, the target was the elimination of Jewish blood, which they called extermination, and which, to use a non-Nazi term, we would call annihilation or the final solution, as it were, to the Jewish problem. Anti-Semitism also differs in one other factor: how high a priority it is for the anti-Semite. In Hitler's case, it was numero uno. We have a seamless record from 1919 to his last will and testament to the German people. One of the reasons why we have less anti-Semitism in the United States is that it is not the highest priority of those who hate, neither those who hate on the left nor those who hate on the right. Last point, which comes to your point directly: the more stable a society, generally the more secure Jews are. And in an unstable society, Jews are insecure. They are one of the groups that are targeted. They are targeted by both extremes, by the extreme left and the extreme right. In Malmo, they have a particular situation, because the situation in Malmo does not necessarily reflect conditions in Sweden, but grievances from the Middle East. And essentially, since you cannot impact the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or the Israeli-Arab conflict, what you do is you sublimate that and you attack the Jew next door. And that's one of the things that we have. I'm going back in September, October, to conduct a series of focus groups with precisely the Middle Eastern students who are living in Sweden, or the students from Middle Eastern origins, because they're no longer Middle Eastern students, who are visiting this exhibition to see how and whether it changes perceptions, how it changes perceptions, and to engage in a conversation so we see the impact of this exhibition. We opened in May 26th, and it was too late in the school year to see school children going through with classes. So I will go back once the school year begins to be able to assess what the impact is of a direct confrontation with the Holocaust on students who have not known this, who have not experienced this, and who tend to come from a society which diminishes that, even if it does not deny it.
How do they react to the exhibition, Michael?
Well, the reality is we have done focus groups on the first groups that attended. It is impactful. We know it's impactful because it's drawn 600,000 people in Madrid. It was sold out for 7 months in Kansas City, the largest number of people who have ever attended an exhibition at Union Station. It was enormously successful in New York. So the question is not how it will impact in Sweden, because remember, Malmo has a very unique historical function. Malmo was the city in which Jewish refugees arrived when they were escaping from the deportations of Denmark. So it was a place of rescue. And Sweden itself was instrumental in the rescue because it received Scandinavian Jews and welcomed them to Sweden. And Malmo was the symbol of that. Now it's a symbol of anti-Semitism because of the shift in population. Now, having said, and also because of the notion that the politicalization of the relationship between Jews and Muslims based on what happens in the Middle East. And consequently, that's a transition, that's a change. If you ask me as a historian, historically, Jews were better off in Islamic countries than they were in Christian countries. but that was before the advent, because as a religious system, Islam believes that Jews are people of the book. They are protected. They must pay a discriminatory tax, but once they pay the discriminatory tax, they are protected, and consequently, they should not be targeted. But we have the politicalization of that relationship. Therefore, it's moved from religious anti-Semitism to political anti-Semitism, and that's complicated the situation.
And at the crossroads of that is Islamism, which is political Islam, which politicizes anti-Semitism within the religion, tries to do that within the religion.
Which tries to do that, which is also ironically undergoing a crisis at this point in its own particular way, because several Islamic countries, several Arab countries have now made peace with Israel. And Saudi Arabia seems to be in a situation where it has a de facto peace with Israel, even if it's not an admitted peace. And prior to this, Wahhabism was one of the fundamentalist, ultra-fundamentalist views that promulgated anti-Semitism. So the question that we have over the short term is, let me put it to you in the unique historical forms. Couples who are getting divorced sometimes ask the question, when do we tell the children? Now, the peace that you have between Israel and some of the Arabs through the Abraham Accords is a very interesting peace, because it's a peace of the elite. And the peace of the elite, the question becomes, when do you tell the people? And if you tell the people that you have made peace with Israel and you regard Israel as a strategic ally, and they've made peace with Israel not because they love Israel, but because they regard Israel as useful for their political situation, both in terms of movement from an oil-based economy to a knowledge-based economy. And Israel is ironically going to be a source of water, and water is exceedingly valuable in the Middle East because of Israel's successful desalinization. So the question becomes, when do you tell the people? And if you tell the people, and as you get used to doing business with Israel, the question then becomes, you can't regard Israel as demonic, and consequently you have to change your views toward the Jews. That is Shia Islam, but not Sunni Islam. So there will be an alternate source of radicalism, most especially of Iranian radicalism, that will target Israel and target Jews. But that's just the crisis in the Islamic world of political Islam. If you have a political movement and the politics change, then all of a sudden it takes time. We call that a cultural lag. It takes time for that change to be felt in the general population.
Yeah, that's a very interesting perspective.
But Malmo has one more thing which we have to understand. Malmo has a very large Palestinian population, and the Palestinians feel double grieved at this moment. They feel grieved by Israel, and they feel grieved by their fellow Arabs who have made peace with Israel, and therefore have said essentially that the Palestinian conflict is not the central conflict of the Middle East, and they feel that they've been sold down the river by their fellow Arabs, and consequently their grievance is deeper, which makes them more dangerous. And this is going to be an interesting confrontation with anti-Semitism and with the radical evil, because Jews tell a narrative of the Holocaust, and the Palestinians have yet to understand that narrative, which is so central to the very being of the Israeli state, essential to the consciousness of the Israeli state. And as you have in your film, when you say never again, that has real political implications. When a society is saying we will not be victimized again, we will not be dependent again, we will not be powerless again, and I, dispassionately, I would advise the Palestinians understand the Israeli narrative, because even if Israel is your enemy, a wise person understands their enemy and understands their enemy very well, because that's one of the ways in which they can achieve political goals with their enemy, is by understanding their enemy.
Yeah, that hopefully will happen. It's interesting to see how developments in the Middle East affect places as far away as even Malmo, and also hopefully the exhibition will get through to Palestinians to better understand one of the essential identities of aspects of Israel in order to do business with Israel and get their own part of peace and autonomy. What I've seen in Amsterdam, where I'm from, is that many times youth from the Muslim immigrant population resists Holocaust education. They say it's not true, it's a lie, it's Israeli propaganda, and they don't want to listen to it. I hope your exhibition can get a step further than a teacher.
Well, let me give you an interesting example. The government of Malmo and the regional government of the region has purchased in the neighborhood of 50,000 tickets for students to see the exhibition. So to their credit, they are confronting it head on. Now, there's only a limit to what an exhibition can do. Even though I'm in the business of creating exhibitions, I don't have any illusions as to the limitations of what it can do. But this should develop a series of conversations as to what this represents, and should offer a very interesting opportunity to understand precisely this part of the Israeli narrative. And let's also be clear, the Holocaust is part of the Jewish narrative at this point in history.
Let me ask kind of just something, just to clarify. The population of Palestinians is concentrated there, right? It's not as strong in the rest of Sweden. Is that correct? And the other question that's connected, is Holocaust education mandatory in public schools in Sweden?
Let's go back to answer the first question. Immigrants tend to move to where other immigrants have been. They're very interested. Let me give you a contrast. One of the things that Angela Merkel did enormously successfully in Germany is when they received a massive number of Syrian immigrants, they spread them out throughout the country.
Yes.
So they did not create a ghetto.
Yes.
And that also means something about the acculturation of the immigrant group. Because if you're spread out in the country, then you have to learn the native language more quickly, and you cannot function over a very long period of time in your own language. Let me give a Jewish example. I once almost got thrown out of a synagogue when I was speaking on a Sabbath morning, because I was speaking in an ultra-Orthodox synagogue in Cincinnati. And I said, the reason Rabbi Eliezer Silver became a leader of something called the Vad HaHatzalah, the rescue committee in the United States, was that he was more assimilated than his fellow rabbis. And that's because he lived in Cincinnati. Now, when they almost wanted to kill me because assimilation was antithetical to the perspective of Haredi Jews, I said, but you have to hear the next word. Because he lived in Cincinnati, he had to function in the English language in a way in which a rabbi who lived in Brooklyn or in New York or in Newark or even in Chicago, did not have to function in the native language because he was surrounded by, and in those days it was all men, he was surrounded by people who spoke Yiddish. Rabbi Silver was not surrounded by people who spoke Yiddish. The earlier Jews who came to Cincinnati were German Jews. So consequently, he learned English, and therefore he became the spokesman of the group. So a immigrant group, and when I write about anti-Semitism in France, I often write there is anti-Semitism in France, but it's not necessarily of France, by which I mean that if you are a Frenchman and you accept liberty, equality, and fraternity as fundamental values of your society, you accept Jews as fellow members of that society. But if you have not acculturated into French values, into Swedish values, tolerance, pluralism, democracy, then it is in the country, but not necessarily of the country. And part of what we see here is an effort to confront that head on in a dramatic way. Let me add one other thing that again, when you say there's Holocaust denial in the Arab world, you have to say we live in a mad universe. Who should deny the Holocaust? The Germans. Who should speak of the Holocaust is other people who say, look what Western civilization did, look what Western values were capable of doing. And you have a situation in which the president of Iran denied the Holocaust, and the president of Germany said, we did it, we have to learn from it, we can't do it again. And we have to establish ourselves as the anti-Nazi. And why Iran, which was bizarre, Iran had a wonderful record during the Holocaust. It was a place in which Jews found a haven. There were the children of Tehran. It was a police station of Palestine. So it's the madness of our world that that man should deny the Holocaust. President of Germany, the Chancellor of Germany, Hitler's very office, accept the Holocaust and accept that they were perpetrators and the responsibility of perpetration.
So that was very informative. I just want to know whether Holocaust education is required in Sweden.
Not fully, not yet. World War II education is required. And the other problem for Sweden is that Sweden has to come to terms with the fact that it was quotation marks neutral. But its neutrality included making a fortune as being, and you have to realize that there were three neutral countries in Europe, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland. Spain was—
So you don't count Portugal?
Well, Portugal was less significant because it wasn't bordering on German occupied territories. I could also say Turkey was neutral, and Turkey has a European and Asian thing, but let me speak about the three.
Okay.
Spain was essential for information. Every spy ring possible was there. Sweden was essential for trade. Sweden is a seafaring country. Sweden allowed German troops to go through Sweden to Finland. Switzerland was valuable for foreign currency and money, and consequently neutrality was not a function of the country, but a function of German needs. Nazi Germany needed a place of information, Spain in the west, Turkey in the east. Nazi Germany needed a source of foreign currency, Switzerland, and they always tell the story that they couldn't go through the Alps, but they forget the fact that they could have come in across Lake Geneva from France. And finally, Sweden was a source of trade. Now, Sweden changed its neutrality to lean toward the Allies in 1944, which is one of the reasons why Raoul Wallenberg was allowed to go into Hungary, because by 1944, everybody knew that Germany was going to lose the war. So the question always becomes, in Sweden, Yes, will they tell the full story? Now, to their credit, Sweden 20 years ago, 22 years ago, published a book that was distributed to the entire population in the 7 languages that people speak in Sweden on the Holocaust. The Swedish government led in convening an international conference that led to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. In 2000, the Swedish Prime Minister did that, and it led in that sense. And why did it want to teach the Holocaust? Not so much because it wanted to teach about Jews, but because it wanted to teach about democracy, pluralism, tolerance, respect for human dignity and human decency, against racism and against anti-Semitism, and found the Holocaust was an enormously useful tool. So Sweden does teach the Holocaust and has made unique efforts to teach the Holocaust, but it's now confronting this population in a very bold and very important way, and we'll see how it turns out. I'm an empiricist. I want to know what happens.
Let's hope it will be a useful tool in also influencing this population into a less anti-Semitic population. And we see it throughout Europe. It's tragic that there is a lot of attention for Holocaust history, and there is the intention to learn as much from it for the present and the future. And as a result, there is more openness in Europe, which is not originally an immigration country, to accept people in need, whether it's economic need or whether it's the need of security and freedom, and to also, there is a need in Europe to have people from outside because there are not enough people for certain professions and jobs. So there's more openness to immigration, but unfortunately, also out of this consciousness about the Holocaust. But unfortunately, the new people bring more anti-Semitism in than was the case long since World War II. And there is a reluctance to challenge that, because that could be seen as racist, which we don't want to be after the Holocaust. But now the creative question, I think, is, can we take on the anti-Semitism and other values that are not about equality in new coming people, without discriminating them, without disrespecting them, without taking their rights from them?
Well, you've asked a good question. I don't think we have to take rights from people. I think we have to protect rights of all people, and that becomes a very important element involved. The other question becomes, Europe is now undergoing a dramatic transformation because of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. Sweden is now going to be joining NATO, something inconceivable 6 months ago, something inconceivable 110 days ago. So you have Finland is joining NATO, something inconceivable. We're now on the 103rd, 104th day of the war in Ukraine, was inconceivable 110 days ago. So Europe and Poland has now received essentially Warsaw itself. I was in Warsaw last month now. Warsaw itself increased its population by 25% with Ukrainians. They have opened their schools, they've opened their healthcare, they have received them. Not so much because they're enormously gracious and hospitable, even though they're behaving that way, an extraordinary way, but because they're deeply afraid that if they don't stop Russian aggression in the Ukraine, then Poland is next, Romania is next, Hungary is next, and consequently they want to offer whatever measure of assistance is possible. This is a transformed Europe, and one could never have predicted this type of solidarity, and one could have never predicted this type of support for NATO, and this type of turning and reliance on the United States. So if you're in Europe right now, the conditions have dramatically changed. And there may also be an exaggerated sense of the power of Jews in the United States, which means that if you want to be in alliance with the Americans, then you have to tone down anti-Semitism, whether you want to or not. And we'll see what the impact of that becomes as well. That's what there's a term for that, ironically, which it's called positive anti-Semitism. In other words, the exaggeration of Jewish power, which leads you to tame anti-Semitism, is a positive outcome of anti-Semitism, because there's a paradox. Jews have never been as powerful as our enemies have suspected us of being. And we've probably, with rare exceptions, and the Holocaust is one of them, never been as powerless as we imagined ourselves to be. So we have wrestled with the question of how do you live with the relative insecurity of a minority in a majority culture? And how do you thrive under those conditions? And that can be one way of describing the history of Jewish life in the diaspora.
Very interesting. Let me ask one other, we're kind of going off the questions, but you know, you always raise such amazing things that it's okay. And Evelyn can ask questions, but I just want to know, the thing that I worry about is that after the exhibition closes, that's it. What then continues the work? Because, you know, in marketing, we say you need at least 3 hits. And really nowadays with all the social media, you need a lot more to keep things in people's mind. And then of course, there's children that are just being born or they're too young to go to the exhibit. So how do you continue that into the future?
Well, the answer is we don't know, and the government of Sweden will have to be imaginative in follow through. We've given them a tool. They will, 22 years ago, they developed another tool.
Right.
And the tools today are ironically not going to be books.
Agreed.
The tools today have to be in the social media. They have to be interactive. They have to be dynamic. They have to be in a dramatic way, reaching the generation in the language that it speaks. And I laugh because I say I'm a tech immigrant because I speak with a heavy accent. My grandchildren are tech natives. They speak without an accent and they function normally. And I laugh because I was working with my grandson a couple of weeks ago, and I was looking at the instruction manual, and he was fooling around with the technology, you know, touching this, touching that, touching the other thing. He got there much more quickly than I did, even though the instruction manual is designed to tell you how to use the product. He intuitively used the product. I had to think about it, contemplate it, look it up and all of that. So we have to think of tools that go in the language of the population we seek to reach.
Evelyn?
I think given the time, we have to ask our last question. Michael, what do you advise our listeners who are in America and outside to do as individuals to combat anti-Semitism today?
One is not accepted.
Very important.
And to, Holocaust education, Holocaust history developed three typologies: the perpetrator, the victim, the bystander. And we've now discovered the bystander is a more complicated situation. There are enablers,
Right.
there are people who stood idly by and the like. We've developed one moral category, which is the upstander.
Mhm.
And the upstander is the person who will not accept hatred, anti-Semitism, bullying, racism, all of the phobias that we have, will stand up and take a stance and say, not here, not now, that's not what you can say, that's not what you can do. And consequently, the first is don't give up, confront it, grapple with it, and remember that we have to oppose anti-Semitism, as with all forms of racism, first as it emerges, because it's easy to quash at the beginning. It's much more difficult the more developed it becomes. And the other is we have to work for a healthier, more stable, and more tolerant society, because it's in that context that the bacilli of the bacteria of anti-Semitism metastasize and ultimately form a much more dangerous threat to the world, to society, and to human dignity and decency.
Thank you.
Michael, those were wonderful last words. Unless there's really something you want to add, I would like to end with that because it's very compelling and it goes with our message. I will say our tagline at the end. So first, I thank you very much. I thank our listeners. If any of you have not seen Evelyn's documentary, Never Again Is Now, you can see it on Amazon and YouTube. And Mike Lozana, for any of those people who haven't seen it yet, is, as we said, he's a frequent interviewee and frequently a producer on Holocaust documentaries. My nonfiction Holocaust theater project, using drama to create empathy, is at thinedgeofthewedge.com. And as always, we ask everyone, whenever you can, without putting yourself in physical danger, please speak up against anti-Semitism and all hate.